Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel where today I'm going to be talking a little bit about this. This is the Rodulin Linnstrument, which is an expressive alternative to a keyboard controller. And I've had this for 2 years now, and I just thought the time probably is right for me to make a little video about it, to tell you my experiences with it, what I think is good and what I think is not so good about it. Perhaps you've been thinking about getting an expressive controller yourself and you're not sure what to get. And perhaps my experience and my views might help you shape your own idea of what is right for you. So, first things first, I'm going to have to do a little bit of history now. I hope that won't put you off too much. So, in the early days of electronic music instruments, the most famous instruments of the time were the theremin and the onde martenot, which is a kind of successor to the theremin in many ways, a more advanced version of it, as it were. And those early instruments had very basic sound sources. I'm sure you know the sound of a theremin. It is basically a sine wave oscillator that can be controlled in two dimensions, pitch and amplitude. So you do pitch with one hand, you do amplitude with the other. And the onde martenot, pretty much the same kind of thing, except that you have on the early versions, you have a dummy keyboard that you move your hand over, wearing a little ring attached to a string, and that is controlling the pitch. And of course, the dummy keyboard allows you to see which note you are playing, and you can aim for the right notes more easily. And then the other hand is pushing a pad that is controlling the amplitude. On the onde martenot, you did actually, I believe, have, of course, in later versions, you had an actual keyboard that wobbled, so you could do your pitch bends. And of course, when you're just moving your hand in the air, like on the theremin or the early onde martenot, or later onde martenot, just using the string, the ruban, I think they called it, you just wiggle your hand, a very natural movement. With a theremin, you would do like this. And also on the onde martenot, I think you had two sound sources that you could mix together a little bit to create some timbral variation. In addition, the onde martenot, I think they also developed some, not speakers, but acoustic resonators that would also shape the sound as well as make it sound more like an acoustic instrument. And so they both were focused very much on expression. They were thought of as, in many ways, as acoustic instruments with dynamic playing styles, and also they were embraced by the classical music community at the time and used in many orchestral works. Now, if you fast forward a few decades, you have the birth of the modern synthesizer with Bob Moog and Don Buchla. Although, of course, in the interim, you had all these people who experimented with using signal generators and filters and radio equipment and lots of other stuff to create sounds, which is quite a different thing. But out of that grew, I think, in many ways, some of the seeds of the ideas that Don Buchla and Bob Moog had, which was to create a purpose-built device that could do many of the things that you could do with a signal generator and all those things that you would have used in the earlier experimental music. But one quite major thing happened. The expression that was intended with these new musical instruments was through the use of patch cables and moving dials and sliders. They weren't really intending for there to be a sort of a human organic kind of expression in the same way as there would be in the theremin or the onde martenot. It wasn't really the early intention for it to be played like a conventional musical instrument. It was meant to be and more experimental, certainly, especially Don Buchla, of course, who thought that that was paramount to his philosophy, indeed. Um, and so when they decided to put when keyboards were put on these devices, initially they were just on-off switches that would regulate into note steps the voltage that controlled the pitch of the main oscillator. So you've gone from the expression of the theremin and the Ohnmachtno to on-off switches. And of course, the big revolution that Bob Moog and Don Buchla did wasn't so much the expression, it was the timbre, the way you could now shape the timbres of the sound in new and interesting ways, and even replicate a lot of traditional instruments, because you could create any waveform you wanted. And of course, initially, a lot of this would be based on just using an oscillator bank of sine wave oscillators, because when you add sine wave oscillators together, you can create any kind of wave shape. So that was quite a big change. And unlike the early electronic instruments, this was not embraced by the classical music community at all. And this is partly also because this happened in America, and of course, the other revolution in electronic music happened in Europe, in Russia and in France. And of course, the mindset of the time also, because that was at the height of modernism and futurism and the early start of surrealism, all those things. So we had all these art movements in Europe, especially in France, and also, of course, in pre-revolutionary Russia, and of course, slightly post as well, that focused a lot on breaking down the traditional notions of art and aesthetics. And these instruments slotted right in. That was not the case with 50s and 60s, 60s America, where, of course, you had a kind of generation divide already happening because of the advent of rock and roll and pop music and those things. And this led to a growth in snobbishness as well, unfortunately, which meant that synthesizers were, in a way, ostracized and even vilified by the classical music community. And many people got this misconception quite early on that you now had a musical instrument that you didn't need to learn how to play. It didn't require any skill, any practice, any training, etc., or any musical knowledge, which of course is all absolute nonsense. But which was later proved, of course, by Wendy Carlos, of course, when she did the Switched on Bach album, which proved that virtuosity can exist in the synthesizer world, and that actually changed people's conceptions of it in America in particular, whereas in France, the view of synthesizers would have been rather different at that time as well. But my main point was that the expression was not in the controller. The controller was basically just an on-off switch keyboard for a long time. And the expression was in how you set it up, how you patch it, how you change the settings of it while playing. And as a little aside as well, we must mention that Roger Linn, he was the one who did the Linn drum, of course, which became one of the starting points of the drum machine epidemic, some might say, of the 80s pop music, where all life and soul was taken out of drum tracks because they were all on time and they didn't have any dynamics whatsoever. And perhaps he is making up for that now. Now, of course, you know that later MIDI controllers, certainly after in the 90s onwards, they were a lot more advanced than being on-off switches. You got to a point where the standard MIDI and keyboard controller had the following features. It has on-off switches, which of course are the keys, but it also has dynamics, which wasn't a given, by the way, in the 80s. So you have velocity. When you push a key, how hard or quickly you push it creates a signal as well, in addition to the on-off switch. And then you have what became the two standard expressive controllers that come with most keyboards, which is the pitch bend wheel, which is spring-loaded, and then you have the mod wheel, which is not spring-loaded, which means you can set it to a certain position and leave it there. It basically is just like a knob or a slider. So now you have, I suppose, 4 levels of control, but of course it is on 2 hands. So you have 2 levels of control on one hand, 2 on the other. So now you're actually getting closer to the early electronic music instruments, but it still doesn't feel as organic, perhaps, as those early days, but even the slightest movement of your hand would suddenly make a difference, because MIDI controllers, they operate at 128 levels of stepped precision, which isn't very precise or organic, but that's another story. Now, the point is, I think that after expression having been taken out of electronic music instruments, they were gradually coming back in again. And I would say that especially the last decade, the 2010s, is perhaps a decade when people really, really wanted to get that expression back. The 10s have seen lots of expressive controllers come. You have several keyboard controllers that now have more control of continuous pressure, for instance. You have the Keith Macmillan, what's it called again? The Q Nexus or something like that, or is it the Q board? I'm not sure. It's Keith Macmillan has something. You have the Linnstrument, of course, and you also have things like the expressive E touché, which of course is the old paradigm from the Onde Martenot. You have your bow, as I think they called it, even on the Onde Martenot. You have a separate controller on the side that is your expressive controller, but one controller works in different dimensions, which means you get loss of control on one. Yeah, but still you have to use 2 hands, and you're doing control on one and you're doing your playing with the other. So that's slightly different. One thing that Roger Lynn wanted to do was to put the expressive control on each and every key. And that is actually I wouldn't say, I'm not sure how revolutionary that is, or if somebody else came up with the thought first, but certainly his way of doing it is quite an ingenious one. He probably spent quite a few years just designing and planning this controller to make all these controls be on one key. Now, so for instance, on your regular keyboard, my regular keyboard with the mod wheel and pitch wheel, basically you get all these controls on each and every note. So when you push down a note on the Linnstrument, you get initial velocity, you get the pitch value. You can also set it to have absolute pitch, which means when you push on the side of a pad, you actually get a pitch that is slightly higher or lower than the nominal pitch of that note. Or you can set it to snap to the correct value when you push any part of the pad. And then you have the pressure you put against this pad, not just the initial pressure, but the continued pressure, and that is the control value. So that could be your mod wheel or your a breath controller, for instance, or an expression pedal. And then you have this direction, the y-axis, which latches a little bit. So if you do that and you move away, it stays in the same position. So it's like a mod wheel in many ways. And then, of course, you have the side to side, which is your pitch bend. And if you just do it like this within a note, you get a nice vibrato, and you can adjust the tempo very easily and naturally. Because this is what people do when they play keyboard and they want to do vibrato on a note. They do like this on the keyboard that doesn't have expression. But on the Linnstrument, you actually get vibrato when you do that. And you can also set it up so that your pitch bend values, if they are the same on the Linnstrument as in your instrument that you're playing, you can go from one note to another exactly, and you know exactly which note you're on. So, and these are things that really make the Linnstrument stand out. There are other things that I think are really good about it. One is that you see this is actually quite small playing surface, but of course everything is easy to get to, which means it is a lot smaller than the full-sized keyboard that has the same number of keys. You can get the full MIDI range of keys available on this surface at once. So you don't have to do octaves up and down if you map it like that. Now, there are many standard ways of mapping the instrument. Of course, you can map them in fourths, fifths, octaves, whatever you like, which makes it very versatile. So there's a bit of an overlap here. So if I push a note, you can see it lights up all the other ones that are the same. Well, it should do. I thought it did. Maybe I'll change the setting. Oh, there it is. So there's a bit of an overlap from one row to the next. And this layout also means that when you're doing chords, you don't change the shape of your hand when you transpose a chord. When you want to do a major chord, it's always the same shape. When you want to do a minor chord, it's always the same shape. Of course, this depends on how you map your instrument, but if you map it in a standard way, you will always have the same shape of fingering, just like on a guitar. And I think that this is a kind of controller. If you are coming from, you're a guitar player or a string player, and you're used to working with a fretboard, this is going to feel a lot more natural than going to a keyboard if you're not used to using a keyboard. So this is definitely for people who like playing strings. Now, I used to play a little bit of guitar when I was younger, but I mean really talking just really, really, really basic improvised noodling kind of level. But still, this kind of interface feels very natural to me. It feels very intuitive. Now, I'm going to mention some cons now, because there are a few things that are trickier on the Linnstrument, I think, than on a regular keyboard. One thing that I'm going to mention something good first. The best expression, the easiest expression to use on the Linnstrument is pressure. So pushing down. It's very easy to be extremely accurate, sensitive, precise, expressive with that movement. You can vary the pressure. This is something that human hands are really, really good at. It's also very easy to do the vibratos by moving side to side. Very natural movement, pitch slides, absolutely amazing. Now, one dimension of control that is a little bit tricky though is the y-axis. I've experienced, and it might just mean it takes more practice because I haven't used it much because I found it a little bit fiddly to use the y-axis as a controller. Usually I don't need it, but yes, it's there and it's nice to have the option, but I found it a little bit hard to do that accurately, consistently, and with repeated precision to use the y-axis. Another thing that I think for me, because before I had the Linnstrument, I had a breath controller. I had an electronic wind instrument, the Audio Silphio. And one thing that, of course, I like doing on the Linnstrument is to play wind instrument virtual instruments, so VSTs. And I use the push dimension to emulate breath pressure, and I can do that quite accurately. I can do it with the same kind of sensitivity and feel that, at least it feels like that to me, that I can with a breath controller. So I can imagine breathing and I can do that in the same kind of way. But one important difference is that when you push, this is per note that you push down, which means that you can't really do trills on the instruments, because when you push two different notes, they each have their own pressure value, and when you drop one, you are losing the pressure value of the other, and it doesn't behave the same way that if you had a continuous controller that was independent of the notes. Now, it is possible to set up a line at the bottom that can be a continuous controller, but it has to be controlled by sliding your hand. It is possible to connect a keyboard controller and use the mod wheel instead, but of course then you're losing some of the point of the instrument. What I would have liked to have seen on the instrument, and actually this just occurred to me today when I was making this, started making this video, is that one thing I would have liked to see on the instrument was to have an independent pressure controller. So, for instance, you have the option of setting the bottom row here. But what if you could set the bottom row or just one patch in the corner here? It doesn't have to be more than one. And that is controlling the pressure level for all the notes played. As long as you push that, that is the global pressure level, and it will ignore the ones from the individual notes. If you release that, it will use the individual notes. That would allow you to play woodwind naturalistically just by using that as your wind controller and this as my note controller. So that's just a thought. So it has potential, of course, for being even better. Another thing that I would say is a little bit of a con for me is that using this like a keyboard for instruments that require velocity control rather than continuous data like expression or breath control, it's not the most accurate. Again, just like with the Y control, it's hard to control the velocity accurately when you play this. It takes practice, but the thing is, because it doesn't move when you hit it, it moves so little, it's a very different feel. It doesn't feel as natural and intuitive as a piano keyboard style controller does. MPE. I'm going to say a few words about MPE. Now, this does have MPE, of course. This is one of the early devices that had full MPE support. But still, to this day, many years later, there are very few virtual instruments or synthesizers that support MPE natively. That is usually not a problem, because what MPE does, in a nutshell, is that it creates hidden instances of the same instrument that respond to different MIDI channels. So if you know that, and therefore know how MPE works, you also would know almost right away that there is a workaround. So, for instance, if you are working in your digital audio workstation with a virtual instrument, and you want to create an MPE effect, what you can do is to add several instances of the same instrument and then assign each of them to a different MIDI channel for input control instead of Omni, which often might be the default. And then you set those to the MIDI channels that you can set up in the instrument very easily in the setup. You set up here, you set up your MIDI channels here. And that means you can have MPE. It'll be easier to edit afterwards if you need to, and it'll be easier to play. And also you can have slightly different settings already in each instance of the virtual instrument. So in many ways, it is better to use so-called poor man's MPE and have several instances manually set up than to have an MPE-enabled virtual instrument. Just a quick chat about that too, because maybe not everyone knows. So MPE, the whole idea about MPE is that instead of having, on the regular keyboard, you have Aftertouch is a global control, so it applies to all the sounds, even when you're playing polyphonically. And the same with mod wheel. There's one mod wheel. It controls all the sound from all the sound sources that are being played at the same time. Your pitch bend applies to all the sound sources at the same time. On the Linnstrument, you can set it up to work exactly that way, or you can say that each consecutive note will be sent on a different MIDI channel. You can set up to 16 channels, I suppose. So when I push one note now, its data is sent to the first channel. When I push a second note, that is sent to a second channel, and which means that now the pressure and all the data, control data for these two notes, is sent on two separate MIDI channels and will therefore affect instruments differently that are assigned to those channels, which means I can also pitch bend up and down at the same time. I can have different pressures. I can have different y-axis movements. Oh, that's a bit tricky, of course, from this angle. And that's how it works. And not that many instruments are actually enabled for it directly natively, but it's easy to work around, and I think the results are actually better. So I have heard some people say that I don't want to get a Linnstrument because there's nothing that's MPE enabled that I want to play with it. But that shouldn't be the issue, because you can get around it. So I mentioned some cons now, and I think I mentioned most of them. So the velocity is hard to control. The y-axis is hard to control. These require a little bit more practice, of course. And of course, you can't have easily a continuous pressure message at the same time as playing different notes. So those for me are sort of the three main cons of the Linnstrument. A fourth con, perhaps we should mention, is price. It is quite a pricey device. The smaller version now costs, at the moment, I checked just before making this video, 850 UK pounds. And the bigger version costs from 1200 to 1300, depending on where you shop. So quite a pricey thing. I'm going to say another pro now, because you may have noticed, if you have looked at the Linnstrument, that there are these texts going all the way around the edge. It isn't that decorative, I must admit. Sometimes I would have liked that to be a neutral border around here when I'm playing, because I think it actually looks a bit distracting. But the reason it is so clear is because this is part of the menu system. And the brilliant thing about this kind of control layout is that not only is it a good playing surface, it also makes a brilliant user interface for controlling settings. So all these texts around here are your different settings things. So you go into the different menus and you have different things that you can control. And it is so easy and intuitive to use this interface to control the settings. It is probably the best I've ever used of any device, pretty much, unless there is a dedicated switch or knob on the panel. Yes, that's how good it is. So it's so easy to set up MIDI channels, to set up your note values, to set up your scales, colors, everything, what controls are being controlled with the Z, Y, X axis, the pitch bend values. Everything is so easy to set up. It is absolutely brilliant. Another pro, I would say, if you look at the controls here, it is both USB MIDI and it is MIDI DIN MIDI, which is great. It can also be powered over DIN MIDI. You set it into low power mode, that's the menu item, and then a power-enabled MIDI device, which I'm not sure if that's part of the MIDI standard, but it certainly needs a DIN MIDI at the other end, and that would give enough power for this to work because it uses so little. If that's not enough power, you can still connect a USB cable for power only. Other fun things, it has these little screws here, you can see, but in the included with the device are actually lugs for attaching a guitar strap. So you can wear this as the new guitar of the 2020s. And of course, if you have seen videos of Rodelin at NAMM, he would have been walking around playing this with over wireless MIDI, for instance, with a guitar strap. Other pros, and this is of course a very important one that also Rodelin wasn't thinking so much about when he made this. It can be played with one hand. When you have expressive controllers, like your mod wheel and your pitch bend wheel, or your expressive E touche, you need a second hand to control the expression. On the Linnstrument, you can control all the expression on one hand. You don't need to use two hands. And so Rodelin, he actually won an award, which he wasn't expecting, from some kind of association or foundation to do with musicians that had different kinds of physical problems that meant that they could only play with one hand. So it could be people just who they just had one arm missing, for instance. And this can be played with one hand, which actually makes a huge difference to the expressive potential for someone who only got one hand to play with for whatever reason. If you're a guitar player, if you're coming from guitar as opposed to keyboard, this is a lot easier to learn as a layout as well, because you can set up your notes in fourths, fifths, octaves, whatever you like actually on this, whatever you prefer. And of course, once you have your preferred setting, the chord shapes will always be the same. You can just have exactly the same hand shape for each chord, and then you just move it around depending on what your fundamental is going to be. Although there is actually a con with this as well. You know, of course, on a piano keyboard, your chord shapes will vary a little bit depending on which chord you're playing because of the way the black notes are relative to the white notes. But at least all the chord shapes on a keyboard are comfortable for the hand because they all involve spreading out your hands in slightly different ways. Whereas this one will involve twisting your hand at different angles, which means that some chords might be uncomfortable to play. So that's both a pro and a con, I would say, when it comes to the Linnstrument. What else is there to say about it? I think I've said so many things now that are sort of things that I like and dislike about it. I don't want to make this video too long. Is it right for you? Well, that's for you to decide, I guess. But for me, I think it has added a dimension of expression to my playing that has made it a little bit easier for me to play certain things. But I still need my regular keyboard around as well because there are things that are a lot easier to play on that. And it does have a few shortcomings that make it not ideal for me. It's not my perfect dual controller. And particularly the limitation of not being the best controller for controlling dynamics through velocity is something that bothers me a little bit as well. And it's not so much the fault of the controller in a way as it is the fault of many synth manufacturers who don't necessarily allow you to change how velocity behaves in an instrument. A lot of virtual instruments are dependent on velocity for expression, for initial expression, or to change initial sound creation conditions. And although most virtual instruments certainly are easy to set up for expressive control, most allow, of course, mod wheel and one more controller at least, which means you have mod wheel and breath control or expression pedal control, which of course you can map the instrument to, and you can get those. And of course, most also have pitch bend that allows you to use that effectively. So it is easy to use the expressive parts of the Linnstrument in most virtual instruments, but sometimes that velocity dynamic is hard to get just right when you're setting up a virtual instrument for the Linnstrument. So, and I think I should conclude there actually. So for me, velocity, the y-axis, and also the difficulty, I should say, of letting the individual note pressure be a global pressure, to set up that in a way that works for me has been my main negatives of the Linnstrument. But the positives, I think, outweigh it in many ways, because you have here a controller that is so easy to set up. It doesn't take up much space on your desk. It is also quite thin, which also helps when you're playing it with other instruments. Many keyboard controllers are quite thick as well, so they get in the way. They make you work at slightly uncomfortable angles if you're trying to control other hardware, or if you're trying to use your mouse, suddenly that's in the wrong place from what you're used to. With an Linnstrument, it's easy to it's the same size as a computer keyboard, give or take a little bit. It's a little bit narrower actually, this one, and a little bit deeper. And you got room for your mouse next to it. So it's easier to use in many ways as a controller when you're using your digital audio workstation and working with virtual instruments. And it doesn't get in the way as easily as a keyboard. It's very intuitive to use, and the pressure dimension on each pad is sublime, I think. I think it is absolutely brilliant for instruments that allow a really nice level of expression connected with a continuous message from a controller. It's a little bit tricky sometimes to set up your virtual instruments for the Linnstrument, because sometimes you want to limit the range as well of how much they do. There are different ways of converting a MIDI, of course, to make sure it has the right value ranges. I'm not going to go into that in this video. I might say something in another video some other time. But of course, if you want a virtual instrument to behave more like an acoustic instrument, then the Linnstrument is actually quite a good starting point. So I think I'll leave it there now, and thank you for watching. I hope you found this interesting or useful. Do you have an instrument? Are you considering buying a Linnstrument? What are your thoughts on the Linnstrument? Have you got one? Do you like it? Do you have your own pros and cons? Please let me know in the comments, and yeah, I'll see you in my next one. Thanks for watching.